G'day! In this episode of the Mobile Application Framework online training, it is dedicated to discussing the AMX components in detail. Now, I have a problem, or more specifically, you have a problem. There's over 50 different components we can talk about in intimate detail, and we can spend around a whole day going through all of these components, their properties, their behaviors. But your attention span just isn't going to last that long, and honestly, neither is my voice. So what can we do to make this easier for you to learn? Luckily, AMX components really fall into several categories and for all intents and purposes have similar properties and behaviors from you, the developer's perspective. So rather than going through all the components, really we need to only show you a few of the components from each of the categories so you get an idea of how they work and by inference how other components in the same category work too. Now, to make this even more interesting, let's build an actual application while explaining these components, which will help cement the ideas you've learned so far in this course and learn about how you code with the UI components in general, rather than working our way through a dry set of slides on their properties and their behaviors. First, let's have a quick look at the end application, what it looks like to give you a feel for what we're going to achieve. Here on the home screen running in the iOS simulator, you can see we have an application called Neo HR. This mini HR application is designed to list all our employees such that our user can discover colleagues' phone numbers, their email addresses, and even see a picture, which helps enormously when you can't remember what the other person looks like. Okay, now we're going to agree here, it isn't going to be the top 10 application on the Apple App Store or the Google Play Store, but it does provide a data set that most viewers will be familiar with, so it makes a good choice to build a demo on. Now, on invoking the app, it instantly opens to a default employees feature, where we can see in portrait mode the information about our first employee, Ellen Abel. If we rotate the screen left into landscape mode, the app rearranges itself such that a hidden splitter with a list of employees reveals itself. From here, as we select different employees in the list, the right-hand side details update, including a map where the employee is located. As we said, it's a very basic HR application, but you get the idea of what we want to achieve. So we can focus purely on the user interface side of building this application. The data model for this application has already been created. A data control exists to allow developers to access the list of employees and their details, as seen here in the data control palette. How and where the data comes from is immaterial for this discussion, and this nicely fits into our discussions earlier on data controls, is that they abstract away from the underlying implementation. Right, so actually to build this application, what do we need to do first? Well, we need a feature with an AMX page. So in returning to the JDeveloper IDE, let's create that feature and call it Employees. Next, we'll define a single AMX page called Employees.amx. Here we can see the base AMX page ready to go. In creating the page for us, the wizard introduces us to our first component, a layout component called the panelPage component. Layout components help us organize the other components on the page in standard patterns that saves the developer time and effort. Overall, the layout components include a core panelPage component, a table component, various panel components that lay their children out on the vertical and horizontal planes, and pop-up components. One of the key features of layout components is something called a facet. Within each layout component, it may have one or more named facets that are essentially placeholders for other components to reside in, such as footers, headers, margins, and more. If we return to our demo, you can see the panelPage component. And within the panelPage component, you can see three defined facets, namely header, primary, and secondary, which contain an output text field and then two command buttons respectively each. As you'll discover, every page includes a panelPage component within a view component, and these contain all the other components of the page. The header facet shows the page's topmost label. The primary and secondary facets allow you to stack buttons to the left or the right of the header for the user to invoke as primary actions on the page. Finally, the footer facet is for putting components at the end of the page as you'd expect. If the panel page contains more content than it can visibly show on the current device's screen, then the panel page is vertically scrollable with a finger swipe to reveal the other content hidden off the bottom of the screen. Returning to our application, what other layout components do we require? To separate the list from the content on the right, we can use something called a panelSplitter. A panelSplitter component, as the name suggests, splits our page into two parts. When displayed on tablets in landscape mode, the panelSplitter contains a navigation facet displayed on the left-hand side where you can stack actions and lists for the user to invoke. Then on the right-hand side, you show the actual results, or the details. Alternatively, when the panelSplitter is rendered in portrait mode on a tablet or always on a phone, the left navigation facet will be hidden with a button, which upon pressing will reveal the navigation items. Returning to our demo, let's introduce a panelSplitter from the component palette into our employee's AMX page. On dropping the panelSplitter onto the page, you'll note it's made up of a navigator facet for where our navigation items will go, and a panel item ready to show the content of the currently selected navigation item. One of the first things we want to do is to ensure that the navigation items on the left only take up a third of the screen, so we'll set the panelSplitter's position property to 33%. What about on the right-hand side of the page in the panel items of this panelSplitter? How will we lay out these components? Now there's a number of ways to skin a cat here, one being to use a tableLayout component composed of 2 rows of a cell each. Just like the HTML table component, the tableLayout component and its direct children, rowLayout and formatCell, allow a flexible grid to be built on the screen in your user interface. Essentially where rows can shrink and grow vertically based on the size of their children, and cells can span multiple columns if need be. With the tableLayout component, you can achieve all sorts of layouts like split views, flowing and stretching layouts, swim lanes, and tiles. Returning to our demo, from the component palette, let's drag in a tableLayout component into our page within the panelSplitter's panel item component. Next, we want 2 row layouts in the tableLayout component. And then finally, a cell format tag in each row layout tag. Right, let's move on from our layout components and now consider our first data collection component, often referred to as a data view component. These components are some of the most powerful in the AMX component repertoire as they provide considerable functionality for free. As we can see in this application, what we want to do is display a list of employees on the left, where we can finger swipe vertically, showing each employee's name in alphabetical order plus their picture. On touching one of the employees, we then want their details to be updated on the right-hand side. To achieve this list, we'll use an AMX listView component. At its simplest, the listView component can be thought of as an iterator or a for loop used in procedural languages that steps over a data collection, stamping out a row per element in the collection in a vertical fashion. Each row is represented by an AMX list item and can be composed of multiple children like the employee's name and image we saw earlier. Beyond just showing data, the list view can be used to allow the user to select records, invoking actions within the application, and even navigation to other screens. As the list view may contain large amounts of data, it includes optional enhancements to divide the data into groups, such as alphabetical dividers, as well as functions to load more data if needed. Now we could build the list view in our HR application manually, but this is a little tedious and error prone. Instead, MAF will let us create list views and other data view components straight from the data control palette, where we defined our data controls and the data collections earlier. Returning to our demo with the Employees AMX page open, we will expand the data control palette and drag in the Employees collection from the Employees list data control as a MAF list view. On doing so, JDeveloper presents us with the list view gallery, which allows us to select from a number of pre-configured layouts for the list view, saving us having to configure the list view properties by hand. We'll pick the list view with dividers as, because we'll have a lot of employees showing in the list, it would be useful to divide the list alphabetically to help the user look through the data. The following Edit List View dialog prompts us for what values to show in the list, but now we want to show surnames. In addition, when the user touches an employee in the list, we want the list to allow the user to select one employee only and keep track of the employee selected. Finally, as mentioned, we want the list to show alphabetical dividers, so we instruct the list to use the surname attribute in order to sort the employees into the alphabetical list and use the last name's first letter to do so. Finally, having set all the options, in returning to the AMX page, we can see the AMX listView tag has been configured for us based on the options we selected in the previous dialogues. We haven't quite finished with the list view, as at the moment we're only showing the employee's last name. We want to extend the list item to include the employee's first name in the output text, and we'd like to introduce and include an image of the employee too. To do this is a little bit more involved. As you can see, currently the page is only showing the last name, which it derives as a row from the bindings.employees.collection model data collection. If you remember correctly, that syntax, that is bindings.employees.collection model, maps to a binding that backs this page. If we select the bindings tab, we'll note a binding called employees that maps back to our EL expression from the list view, bindings.employee.collection model. To view the available attributes for the employees, we select the Edit or Pencil button with the employees being selected. This invokes the Edit Tree binding dialog, which in our case is just a single level tree showing data from the employees list.employees data collection. The important part to focus on here is the available attributes at the bottom and the display attributes. As you can see at the moment, only the last name attribute is displayed. In order to also get the first name, we need to move it to the display attributes. As we know we also want to show the employee's picture later, we'll move the pic attribute now too. So at this point, we've expanded our bindings to include all the attributes we want to show on the screen. On returning to the source code view of the Employees AMX page, in the output text field, we can expand the value property to also include an EL expression to reference row.firstname. Remember, row here refers back to the list view bindings.employees.collection model current row, essentially accessing the bindings we just created. In turn, we'll now drag in an image tag from the component palette, and we can map its source property to the row.pic, which is the other binding we created too. So looking back at the output text component we just modified, as you can appreciate, there's not really a lot to an output text component. It simply displays text, which can be hard-coded or read from an EL expression, as we just saw. In turn, the image component is also pretty simple. It displays images. Did you guess that? Where it's a bit smarter than your standard HTML image tag is that it can not only point to remote or local images on the device, but it can also display base64 encoded images. This is particularly useful if the image has been retrieved from a remote web service where images are typically transmitted in text, or the image is stored in the local database from the data control like we saw here. Within the first cell of the table layout, we want to show the selected employee's details. Note how the details are listed top to bottom with labels on the left and values on the right. Again, we could manually construct this, but MAF comes to our rescue here and will allow us to automatically create the specific layout with labels on the left, fields on the right. In our demo application, this is relatively easy to achieve. We simply drag the employee's object from the data control palette into our page. We then select Form, then MAF Form. We'll remove a number of the attributes, leaving first name, last name, phone number and email. And finally resulting in a panelForm layout and 4 input text controls. The panelForm layout is useful for screens where you have a lot of input text fields. In laying the labels and fields out in 2 distinct columns, it creates a uniform look and feel for the data entry parts of your application. Separately, the input text control, unlike the output text control, not only displays text, but allows the user to edit the text. They do this by invoking the text control, a simple touch in the field, which will then also open the device's virtual keyboard on screen to allow the user to edit the data. Right, next, we want to include a button that invokes a pop-up with 2 links allowing the user to either email the employee or phone them. Let's see how to do this in our demo application. In the Employee AMX page, I'll drag a pop-up component from the component palette and I'll place it before the panelPage tag. Now that's important. Pop-ups always exist as a child of the view tag, not the panelPage tag. Then in my page, we'll use this pre-existing command button, CB2, to invoke our pop-up. This is done by selecting the showPopupBehavior operation from the component palette and dragging it onto the command button. Next, via the property inspector, with the showPopupBehavior tag selected, I configure the popup ID property to call the previously created pop-up by entering its ID, P1 in this case. Now for this particular pop-up, we want the user to be able to automatically dismiss it by touching outside the pop-up once they're done with it. We set the auto dismiss property to true to achieve this. To complete our example, we then drag in 2 Go links into our pop-up as children and configure the Go links with appropriate text values. As well as URLs to either send the associated employee an email or call them via the mobile telephone. From here, let's do some things to tidy up the page. To tidy the pop-up so that the Go links displays vertically rather than horizontally, select both of them in the Structure palette and then via the right-click context menu, select Surround With. We then surround them with a panel group layout control to group them and in turn render it vertically by setting the panel group layouts layout property to vertical. Next, we'll delete the primary facet as we don't want it, and we'll rename the command button in the secondary facet to Contact. When the pop-up displays itself, we'd like it to align itself to the button. So as a final touch, we'll change the page's header to Employee rather than the label Header. So now we've been introduced to the pop-up component for showing modal content. This is typically invoked by a showPopupBehavior tag associated with the command button and auto-dismissed or closed via closePopupBehavior tag in a command button on the actual pop-up. In turn, a command button is designed with a single touch to fire an action or an operational behavior or execute some programmatic code in the background or allow the application to navigate pages. The command button renders as a textual button, while its sister component command link renders as a hyperlink with the same functionality, though the command link can also render itself as a selectable image. Of special note, the command button can be supplemented with additional behavior tags as we saw earlier, such as the showPopupBehavior tag to give it additional functionality. The showPopupBehavior tag, as you know, saves the programmer from having to write code to invoke a pop-up when a button is pressed. Rather, the showPopupBehavior just takes the popup ID as a parameter, and when the parent command button is invoked, the popup will automatically be opened with no special code. So at this point, we've built a substantial part of our application. Let's see how far we've got. This is what we wanted it to look like, and this is what it looks like currently. So we're nearly there. So what do we need to fix? Well, firstly, we can see in the list view that the picture and name are aligned differently from what we actually wanted. Can you think of how to fix that given what you've seen and learnt so far? Then secondly, we're missing the map where the employee is located on the right. Now, admittedly, that's a little bit more complicated and something we'll cover in a future episode where we will specifically look at using the data visualization tags and their associated maps. So in this episode, rather than going through all the AMX components in detail, which, there is 50 of them and would just take far too much time, what we've done is we've categorized the AMX components into the general groups, mentioned to you that, components that exist in the same categories generally have the same behavior. So once you learn one component, you generally know all the other components in that category. And then we actually had a look at building an application using these components, understanding their properties and behavior, but also, most importantly, showing you how to create a page by dragging in components from both the data control palette and, more importantly, the component palette. So hope you'll stick with us. Thanks very much for your time today. More episodes coming up on the user interface design of your MAF application soon.